You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on ShockwaveSkullSessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian.
Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to another episode here on the Shockwaves Skull Sessions podcast. Co-host and producer Matt Hartnett here with you from the Shockwave Skull Sessions studios here in San Lorenzo, California. As many of you are aware, Bob has been really busy lately with gearing up for and getting ready to release the new Inside Metal documentary called The Bay Area Godfathers on the San Francisco Bay Area thrash scene. And so he's been really hard at work on that for the last couple months. And so what we're going to go ahead and do this week is we're going to go ahead and put up an archive episode for you guys. This one was back, originally posted back on March 10th in 2009. The title is called Ye Olde Martin. It's basically, it was Bob. He was joined by author Martin Popoff, John Strednansky and David Tedds. And basically the episode is regarding Martin's book that was released back in 2009 called Ye Olde Metal. Basically, the guys discuss many of the legendary seminal and underground cult classic hard rock and metal albums that were released from about 1968 through 1978. Contain artists like Blue Cheer, Dust, Bloodrock, Robin Trower, Nazareth, just to name a few. Really cool episode here for the real true hard rock music fans who love the underground and obscure hard rock and metal bands from that era. So this is a really cool episode. Definitely stay on the lookout next weekend. We'll be posted on Sunday night a really cool brand new episode of the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. We definitely apologize for not having more new episodes for you guys over the last month or so, but as I was mentioning earlier, Bob's really hard at work in getting this documentary up and running and released, it looks like it's going to be released within the next couple of months. So definitely be on the lookout for the new doc, the Inside Metal doc, the Bay Area Godfathers. And yeah, so here it is, archive episode, Ye Olde Martin from back in March 2009, featuring author Martin Popoff, John Strednansky, and David Tedds.
About to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Heard exclusively on RoadrunnerRecords.com/Skull Sessions. And now, here is your host, Bob Nalbandian.
All right, welcome to the Shockwave Skull Sessions. This is episode number 20. That's right, we've reached our 20th episode of the Shockwave Skull Sessions. And of course, we got a great episode as usual. This episode is called the Ye Olde Martin podcast because this is about the great series of books that we've talked about on previous podcasts. It is the Ye Olde Metal series that Martin Popoff has self-published. He's come out with 4 volumes so far and several more in the works for sure. But as of yet, we've got the first volume, which is Ye Olde Metal 1968 to 1972. The second volume is 1973 to 1975. Third volume, 1976. Fourth is 1977. And actually, the fifth volume, 1978, should be available by the time you listen to this. I know he just got them back from the printers, so check out his books at martinpopoff.com. That is MartinPopoff.com. I believe these series of books are available only through his website. They are special limited edition books, only 1,000 copies per each volume, so they're very rare. But if you are into classic hard rock and heavy metal, this is a must-read. All these series of books, an absolute must. Some great stories behind some of these legendary rock albums. Very seldom told and very informative. Some great stuff here. Definitely you want to check out. But enough said about this, man. This is quite a long podcast, so we're going to get right into it. But before we get into it, want to remind you, of course, this is the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. It is available at roadrunnerrecords.com/skull sessions. All our episodes are available on that site, so you can listen to it via streaming MP3s, or you could download each episode through that site. You could also subscribe to the Shockwave Skull Sessions through iTunes, as well as several other top podcast directories, so be sure to check that out, and be sure to write those comments in, guys. Love to hear those comments. And if you want to email me directly, you can email me at shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com. So feel free to send in those emails. I do answer each and every email, so I love to hear from you, especially about this podcast, because this is a great, great podcast. So let's get right into it. We've got, of course, author Martin Popoff on this episode, and joining Martin and myself, we've got John Strednansky, who we've had in the past. He was on the Uriah Heep episode, and he's also did several interviews for me, including Uriah Heep and Uli Roth on the last Shockwaves Hard Radio podcast, which is my sister podcast, which features interviews with several great bands. John's done quite a few interviews for the Shockwaves Hard Radio podcast. Again, you can check that one out at hardradio.com, also available on iTunes. And along with John Strednansky, we got newcomer David Tedds. This guy is a genius when it comes to classic hard rock and heavy metal. Probably the most informative gentleman I've met this side of John Sutherland when it comes to classic hard rock. So a great, great episode. And David has lived through this entire era. He's seen all the bands that we've discussed throughout this. So great, great information shared on this episode. Also, you can check out a lot of these bands. They've reissued a lot of these records on CDs. So be sure to check it out online. Also, a great source is, of course, Classic Rock Magazine. If you don't subscribe to that magazine, it is a British magazine, I'm sure, as many of you know, and it is available in the States, and they cover a lot of these great bands that we discussed. In fact, they're the few publications currently available today that cover a lot of these great classic rock and heavy metal bands. So check that magazine out as well. Also, speaking of books, I do got to give props to my good friend Bill Hale, who just published his first book. In fact, it should be available probably by the time you hear this podcast. It is called Metallica, The Club Days, and it's a book that I was heavily involved with, and it features some incredible Metallica photographs from their early San Francisco club days, their very first shows, including their shows with original bassist Ron McGovney and, of course, Dave Mustaine, up through the Cliff Burton years. It's all photos and some great text that go along with the photos. A classic, historic book for Metallica fans and just metal fans in general. You can check that out at Amazon.com as well as other bookstore websites. The book is available on ECW Press. And once again, the title is Metallica, The Club Days. With that said, let's get into this Ye Olde Martin podcast without further ado. Once again, this is Martin Popoff, John Strednansky, David Tedds, and myself. Enjoy. This is the Ye Olde Metal podcast, and it is regarding Martin Popoff's Ye Olde Metal series of books, and we've obviously got author Martin Popoff on with this, and joining Martin, we've got John Strednansky, who was on our Uriah Heep debate. What's up there, John?
Hey, how's it going?
And we have newcomer David Tedds. What is up there, David Tedds?
Oh, it's semi-cold here in California, but otherwise everything is lovely.
All right. Well, before we get into Martin's books, let's kind of give a little, for people that aren't familiar with David Tedds, David, why don't you explain what you do and what you've been involved with metal-wise?
Sure. I've been in the music industry 35 years, believe it or not, which probably gives you some clues to my age, but I still got all my hair on like Monty Connor. Wait till he hears that. He's going to go, what an asshole. I worked as director of licensing for Time Warner for 8 years. I've done a ton of years in retail. I've done a lot of reissues. I did the entire Grand Funk catalog as far as reissues go, the entire Queensryche catalog. Robin Trower's Bridge of Sighs, which is on our list here.
Absolutely.
Also, the entire Cactus catalog, and we got some of that stuff on here. And I've worked for an indie label for the past 3 years, and I'm just having way too much fun.
And you also did the Gillen catalog, or at least a few titles from that. Is that correct?
Yeah. I was involved with the what's that?
I said, how could you leave out Ian Gillen?
Yeah, I know. I've been a semi-pro singer my whole life, and I learned about 90% of the stuff I know from the man himself. So, yeah, you're right. I'm a jerk. I was just going to say that if this is based on Martin's book, maybe we should call this Ye Olde Martin.
That is a good
I'm definitely getting old. I'm definitely fitted, that's for sure.
You know what? That is what we are going to title this podcast, Ye Olde Martin.
Right on.
All right, Strednansky, why don't you give a brief update for those of you that aren't familiar with John or that might have missed the Uriah Heep conversation we had?
Obviously, I'm a huge fan of hard rock and heavy metal, which I discovered this music when I was very young, and I was watching TV in Germany when I was living at the time, and this really silly band came on called Slade, and they did this song called Goodbye to Jane. And I never heard anything like that before in my life. And I was a convert ever since that time, and Slade still counts as one of my favorite bands of all time. So it's been a lot of fun. Throughout the years, I've never really abandoned my taste for just good old-fashioned hard rock and heavy metal. And, of course, in the 80s, my biggest accomplishment was when I was the editor-in-chief for Metal Rendezvous magazine, which was published internationally, with a circulation of about 100,000. We did it for about 7 years in the 80s. And in the 90s, I've wrote bios for some record companies. I did some freelance writing, but now I'm basically just a huge fan who likes to contribute whenever he can.
All right. Well, let's get into the books. Martin, before we get into the discussion, why don't you explain for the listeners not familiar with Ye Olde Martin, why don't you explain about the Ye Olde Metal book series you're doing?
Okay, well, what this is, it's a self-published series of limited to 1,000 copies, and they're numbered, and I sign them all, and we basically do, I lay the whole things out myself, I write it all. Basically, I wanted to start something that looked like a series, that was an ongoing series, that allowed me to write about a bunch of bands that there was no way I was going to write a whole book on, and just get right to the matter. Every chapter is just some album by, some band who maybe had one album out, 3 albums out, whatever, just straight to the point. Get these guys on the line, interview them, and just talk to them about that album. The whole thing started where I was writing these things, and just to have some sort of good variable content to read at the site, I was putting them up at the site. But I always thought it'd be cool to arrange them into book form. So there's 4 of them so far. The 5th one is actually at the printers right now. I should have it back within days. It's Ye Olde Metal 1978. But yes, the first one is a bit of a range, 68 to 72, just some really old albums. Now that is really before my time. So that's why I had to sort of spread it out there a little. The second one is 73 to 75. But after that, you get into the years that I, grew up in. I was there buying these things as new releases. So there's a Ye Olde Metal 1976. There's a Ye Olde Metal 1977. They're all 250 pages for a strange and stupid reason to have to do with mailing costs to keep the cost down on these things. And most of them have some pretty cool, rare photos from a buddy of mine in Oklahoma, Rich Galbraith, who has quite a supply of cool old 70s and early 80s shots. So there's a lot of great photos in them as well. But yeah, it's basically, all these bands we grew up with, there wasn't a lot of press on a lot of them. So it's just all these questions a bunch of old guys like us have wanted answered for 30 years. Let's go get those answers, put them into book form, put them into print. In some cases, the first and last time these guys will ever be in a book.
And that's what I love about it, is people that are wondering. These aren't just Martin Popoff giving his views of the albums. He also has great interviews that go along with each of the albums with the artists or the producers or people that were involved in the record, describing the process of making the record. And there's some great stories from the artists, which is included on each of these titles, which makes it very, very interesting. And like you say, although some of the titles that are mentioned here were huge sellers, whereas some of them were not huge sellers, but were equally as good or as classics. Great stuff here. Why don't we start out with your first book, which is 1968 to 1972. And why don't you talk about some of the records you feature in this book?
Well, to give a little bit of an overview, I mean, just so everybody knows, we kind of talked before the show, and I guess as a bit of a format, we're going to maybe pick one that we feel strongly about each. And I mean, you guys are great experts on a lot of this stuff, and just kind of hear your views on some of these albums. The whole idea with this podcast was to talk about some of these smaller bands that we can't dedicate a complete one to. So it's kind of a nice format for that. But just as a range, I'll just rattle through this. We've got Blue Cheer, Vincibus Eruptum, MC5, Sir Lord Baltimore, Bloodrock, War Pig, a Canadian band, Cactus, America's Led Zeppelin, Mountain, America's other Led Zeppelin, Uriah Heep, Look at Yourself, Nitzinger, John Nitzinger from Texas. We got Dust, Heart Attack, Humble Pie, Buffalo from Australia, Captain Beyond. Everybody talks about that one. Trapeze, where we got some good Glenn Hughes stuff in there, and I believe that's pretty much about it. And if I was to pick something that I kind of really enjoyed doing, I would say getting all those Bloodrock guys. I talked to maybe 3-4 guys from that band. Maybe it was 3. But, Bloodrock was this sort of, they were always considered like the poor man's Grand Funk. And, coming out of Texas, they had a lot of albums out, a lot of, personal strife in terms of management things going on, a lot of changes in direction. But, their first album is just this killer, dark, deep purpley, grand funky, just a really good unsung sort of classic. And it was nice getting these guys on the phone. And the other thing I like about the series is that you constantly hear these link-ups between, I mean, they all toured with big bands. They all had big producers.
Well, most of these were on major labels at the time, too, in America. Correct?
Yeah, well, that's the other thing. There really were not a lot of small labels in the 70s. I mean, when you made an album in the 70s, you were on a major label, you got a big producer, and you played with Ted Nugent and Aerosmith. That's how it worked.
I was just going to say, then again, back in the 70s, labels like A&M were kind of considered independent labels, whereas... I suppose.
But, every record was pretty expensive to make. They were all kind of done the same way. They all sound good. So it wasn't really until maybe punk and the new wave of British heavy metal and then American metal through the 80s where you saw these vast quality differences going on in objective quality differences like recording and stuff. But no, I mean, that's kind of all I wanted to say. I mean, I just, with the Bloodrock thing, I just like hearing about that whole Texas situation and playing the cellar and John Nitzinger around and how it all interacts with Terry Knight and Grand Funk and all that. And that's my piece. I'll let you guys pick an album yourselves from.
Well, let's go with David Tedds, because I know David is a few years older and he's probably grown up with a lot of these bands. In fact, just so people know about David's background, you grew up in England, right? And you saw some of the very first Black Sabbath and Deep Purple shows. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was actually thinking that I think between the four of us, with John being from Germany, Martin, you being Canadian, me being born in England, and Bob, you're American, I'm presuming, so we got a nice multicultural thing going on here, right?
Absolutely.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, I did. I lived in England. I was born there, but I also lived there again for about 18 months in 71 and did see some great shows while I was there in small places. Seeing Deep Purple and Uriah Heep and Sabbath and King Crimson and Jethro Tull, all in these really small English halls, free T-Rex, that sort of stuff. That was about the only good thing about staying there, but it was good. Also, with regards to what you're smarting about this Bloodrock album, I love this album. When I was working on the Grand Funk reissues, I did get a chance to speak to Terry Knight many times, and asked Terry if, stories about Bloodrock and his involvement with them. Yeah, they're just great. I love, the first 3-4 Bloodrock albums. I don't think there's a weak song on any one of these.
So did Terry Knight manage the band as well as Grand Funk?
Oh, Terry managed them, produced them, booked them, took most of the money out of their pocket, the whole ugly early 70s manager stuff.
Right.
He's dead now, so he can't sue me for saying that. But, yeah, it's the truth. He did something to Grand Funk.
Oh, yeah. I've heard many stories about that. So was this album, when it came out, I actually had the album. That was the one that had, just the name Bloodrock. And was it, red, white, and blue logo with blood dripping from it, kind of?
Yeah, it's got, smashed glass, right, Martin? Like smashed glass
The flag is more into other ones, and there is a story that they say about the flag too. But yeah, this is the one where it's bloody and the letters are scrawled across it, and it's kind of brownish. Yeah, definitely a very, very cool unsung band. Didn't sell enough copies, and you're right. There was a lot of business hassles that went on with those boys.
Amazing too that when you look at this album, two of the best songs are the last two songs on the album. Melvin Laid an Egg and Fantastic Piece of Architecture. I love those songs.
Yeah.
Were you familiar with this album, Strednansky?
It's funny. I didn't really get into Bloodrock because I lived in Europe. They never really were talked about in Europe, unfortunately. And even Grand Funk, who were considerably bigger here in the United States, were not really that did not make much of an impact in continental Europe. I discovered Bloodrock through a friend of mine, Bob Gamber, who still owns a record store on the Monterey Peninsula to the day to day. And he introduced me to Bloodrock in the early 80s, and I dug them, but it was already I was in a different phase by then, and I never really truly appreciated them. I own the records, and I enjoy them, but honestly, I never really fully got into them.
I'm the same way. I got into him about the same time. I found him in a used record store. I had read about the band at Old Cream Circus, so I had bought him probably early 80s. But by that time, I was well into the new wave of British heavy metal. So, of course, listening back to that didn't really make much of an impact.
So who would you guys say are the great unsungs of metal out of these bands here? I mean, who really did the biggest contribution to metal, do you think?
I mean, for me, the ones for a contribution, I would almost say that Dusk needs to be mentioned, just because of the band members that were in this band. I mean, you got to remember that those guys ended up producing the first 3 Kiss albums, or 2 or 3 Kiss albums. The bass player Aronson ended up in Blondie and even in HSAS. So there's a lot of talent that was in that band, and Heart Attack is one fantastic hard record. And that would have been my pick out of this list.
To me, there's two bands here that deserve special mention. Number one is that my contention is that Blue Cheer's Vincebus Eruptum is the first heavy metal album. To me, there's nothing that predates it as far as an entire album that's just start to finish balls to the wall. Nothing predates that. And the other one, to me, the most influential album or band on this first list here, to me, would be the MC5. I think what they've done still resonates, to this day.
Yeah, and those records, I always look to try to narrow down that definition of metal. And Bob, we've talked about this many times. How
Sure.
To me, it's the second Sabbath, it's Deep Purple in rock, and it's Uriah Heep 1 kind of thing. But there are these full albums that are almost entirely heavy, and those are definitely 2 of them, and Stooges as well, right? The first Stooges.
Yeah, but the Blue Cheer predates even the Stooges and the MC5 by a year.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that was
exactly.
67 Blue Cheer? Or 68?
Late 68.
Okay, 68.
Yeah.
And that, where were Blue Cheer from? Were they LA
They're
band?
from Northern California. Is that right, Martin?
Yeah, definitely. I've always heard them associated with San Francisco, but I mean, they were some crazy guys. They were probably from all over the place, out in the country and everything. There's biker stories that go with the whole thing. There's a lot of acid stories. Pretty funny history there. That is one that would be a very interesting full book if someone ever wanted to write it.
Well, of course, that album is, because everyone, knows this, well, not everyone, but a lot of people know the song Summertime Blues, which was, I guess, kind of a semi-hit and still heard a little bit today. But that whole album, there were songs, I think, like Side 2, wasn't there a song that was like 12 minutes long or something on that? And a lot of long, drawn-out, real, almost kind of an Iron Butterfly-ish kind of drawn-out, acid, trippy kind of sound, but real heavily. That was the first album I remember just hearing the real heavily distorted guitars. Of course, I didn't get into them until probably the late 70s, early 80s, but...
Well, to give away my age, I was about 12 years old when this came out, and I think some older being 14 or 15, a guy across the street had this thing, and at the time I was listening to, just regular pop stuff, top 40 stuff, and this thing just scared the shit out of me the first time I heard it. I couldn't relate to it at all because it was so intense. Yeah, and you are right. The epic jams like Dr. Please on here that go on for like 8 minutes and Second Time Around are just amazing. They are like Iron Butterfly, but the fact that they're just the classic power trio, sort of differentiates them between them and all the bands that had keyboards in the early 70s.
Right.
Yeah.
There are no keyboards on this album.
I'd love to have an opinion on that Dust record, because I need to come back to this. It's not talked about that much when discussions like these happen, but when you really look at the lineup with Kenny Aronson and Richie Wise and Mark Bell, who later became Marky Ramone, I mean, that was almost like a pre-supergroup. And the two albums have several outstanding songs. I mean, when you really listen to the song Suicide, it's about as heavy as one would get it for that era. And on the first record, From a Dry Camel, what an incredible, heavy epic that could rival anything that Black Sabbath could have done at the time.
The other big thing about Dust, of course, is that they had the Sword and Sorcery Viking cover art, the Frazetta cover art, and then the first one had the skulls, right? So they were very, very ghoulish early. And if you ever talk to Mark, I mean, he talks about being quite proud of the cover arts that they did. It's funny, I've heard things about him. I mean, he talked very freely and openly about Dust, but I've heard other times throughout history where he really downplays that past and he wouldn't sign those records for people. But now, I mean, I'm not sure if this has happened yet, but I thought he was working on the reissues of those records. Did anybody know about that?
No, not me.
If anyone would know, it'd be David
I think
Tedds, the reissue king.
I think sometimes these guys probably get pissed off about certain periods in their career if they've got screwed over business-wise, or they remember, maybe some things that happened with management or another band member. And then after a while, I think it just becomes, in a lot of cases, that they just go, you know what, the past is the past. This is now 30, 35 years ago. Let's just move on with it. And they tend to embrace it rather than, have ill feelings about it.
Plus, a lot of times, some of these records, it takes about 10, 20 years, 30 years sometimes before people start recognizing some of these bands. And at the time, they might have had horrible reviews, but then people go in the past and, this happens with a lot of bands from the 60s and 70s. These are bands that were virtually unheard of back in the day that people are starting to get into. And then all of a sudden, these artists are very proud of their work, where before they, would never talk about it, kind of thing.
David, you probably know a fair bit about Cactus. I mean, what is your feeling? I mean, they remind me of a band like that I guess they got pretty bad reviews early on, did they not?
Yeah, I remember reading the review for One Way or Another in Rolling Stone at the time it came out, and they just trashed it. Then again, Rolling Stone famously trashed all the Led Zeppelin albums too.
Right.
There was a difference between sort of what was going on with a lot of critics, just like there is now, and what people were seeing live in a concert hall, and then would go and tell their friends, and and then the whole word would get spread around, and the albums would sell. There was a real disconnect, as there probably is now and has been, between what the reviews were in print and what the average guy on the street liked. Right. Look at the Led Zeppelin stuff, and geez, man, look at, for almost the ultimate case, look at Grand Funk.
Anything else to touch on that era before we get into 76?
This is really the birth time of my love for this music. I mentioned earlier that I was into Slade and Goodbye to Jane. That's what opened the doors for me. And then the next 2 years, the years 73 through 75, were kind of the growing years where I was just sucking everything up like a sponge in terms of hard rock, heavy metal, and all this rock and roll stuff. And so many classics came out in this short era of 2 years, and you got most of them listed here in this book. And how can you compete with some of these? I mean, Nazareth, Loud and Proud, Alice Cooper's Welcome to Nightmare, Nazareth, Hail the Dog, Budgie, Deep Purple. They're all listed on here, but the one that really stands out for me is Buckman Turner Overdrive, Not Fragile. Not too many people would list here because BTO was more known for, taking care of business and their hit singles, but Not Fragile was just this huge, humongous, heavy rock album that just included some of the most amazing heavy songs of that era, specifically the title track that just blew me away right from the start.
Absolutely. I mean, one of my all-time favorite bands, and I still say to this day, Not Fragile, one of the most underrated heavy metal albums of all time. And you hit it. I mean, everyone knows about BTO taking care of business. You ain't seen nothing yet, all their hit songs. But Bachman Turner Overdrive was such a heavy band and such a powerful band. I mean, the title track, Not Fragile, just the way that song builds to the end of it. I mean, that band just had so much dynamics. It wasn't like Sabbath where it was doomy or, distorted like some of these other garage rock bands of the late 60s. It was a real crisp, heavy, clean. I think BTO were the starting of what I call like power hard rock or power metal. It was just powerful. C.F. Turner's voice, just amazing, right? Just through the gut, just natural power in his voice. Definitely one of the most underrated metal albums of all time. I agree.
Yeah, that idea we talked about, the definition of heaviness, and these guys kind of personified in a way that the music sounds slow and sluggish, and it's hard to get out of their system. And Fred Turner's voice sounds like that big holler, just like you're being berated by this big guy with a big belt buckle and jean jacket and the whole thing.
Absolutely.
BTO also had that whole gears and truck driving thing going with them, and the road songs. There's even like a southern rock flavor to those guys, even though they're from Canada. But yeah, there's just something. There's a whole lot of ways that they're not that heavy a band, but then there's a lot of ways just to do with weight and smotheringness and sluggishness that makes them sound heavy. Like when they break into chords, it sounds like it's the culmination of, and Bob, you hit on it with the dynamic situation. That's the thing with those guys.
Absolutely. And image-wise, too, when you talk about metal, so many of the bands of that era, the 70s, went to the whole glam thing and whatnot. But BTO, they were like big truck drivers. It's kind of funny because you had the two big dudes, C.F. Turner and Randy Bachman, the two kind of overweight, like tow truck driver kind of guys, and then you had, Blair Thornton and Rob Bachman, who kind of dressed a bit glamish and glittery, and it just had that contrast. But BTO were just really they came out wearing, hockey jerseys and jeans. Really, they started the whole image of just real working class metal.
And the contrast between the two main vocalists in the band, where you got Randy, who's got almost this sweet kind of gentle voice, and like you said, the blues holler of C.F. Turner, it was great because it did set them apart from having bands who just had one vocalist, one-dimensional kind of singing. These two guys pretty much had it all covered between the two of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Guess who had kind of the old style type success? BTO were the first band to have that new style type success. They were the ones that broke it open and showed an example of what a Canadian band has to do to break the States, and that's play all the time, concentrate on that area. Rush was even somewhat known for neglecting parts of Canada, if you can believe it. They were not big in Eastern Canada and like the Maritimes, and they were not regularly showing up and playing everywhere in Western Canada. They were more known for playing St. Louis and Chicago and all up and down there in the South. And BTO were the first, Rush was the second. Other bands kind of did okay doing that. Triumph, a little bit of April Wine, a little bit of Loverboy, but BTO was definitely the blueprint for that.
I grew up in Detroit, and they were, pun intended, so huge in Detroit in about 74 when Not Fragile came out. They played Cobo Hall, which was 14,000 people. I think they sold, I know it was 3 shows out in a row, and because they couldn't accommodate it schedule-wise, it was one of the only bands that I've ever heard of where they did afternoon matinees on top of the evening shows. And in fact, the show that I saw them do was an afternoon matinee with Rory Gallagher opening, and it started at 3 in the afternoon, and I went into Cobo Hall, saw this full-blown show, came out, and it was still light outside. It was only like 7 o'clock at night.
Wow.
They were absolutely massive in the States around the time that Not Fragile came out. Like I said, especially in the Midwest, just huge.
You mentioned the blues, and I know there's a couple of other albums in this list that were in that second Ye Olde Metal, the Status Quo Piledriver and the Foghat Fool for the City. And, I personally think Status Quo Quo is maybe the greatest blues metal album of all time, but Foghat Fool for the City, I totally just love. It's just this joyous album with Slow Ride and Save Your Lovin' for Me and Fool for the City, Terraplane is on there. But yeah, BTO as well. They had that bluesy thing going on that sort of came up from the South, and you had Foghat doing the bluesy thing that's part of the British thing from the Savoy Brown situation.
I didn't see so much really blues in BTO. I mean, they had a little bit of a southern vibe. I mean, you hear songs on That Fragile like Blue Moaning. I mean, some great, slide guitar work. But, a lot of their hit songs kind of had that traditional BTO kind of strumming that Randy Bachman kind of made famous from the old Guess Who days that he kind of carried over. But they had that identity on their hit songs. But it was almost like they were two bands. They had their hit songs, and they had what you call the B-sides, which were just enormous, heavy, hard rock metal anthems.
Yeah. Who else had that characteristic at that time was Sweet. When you look at what their hit singles were about and what the B-sides or some of the albums were like, it was a day and night. And BTO kind of reminds me of that kind of an approach to their music as well. Much more commercial, accessible singles, but then the real heavy tunes that they didn't even become that well known for, but were really probably the bulk of their stuff.
And it's interesting, I know, Martin, you don't have any Sweet albums until, I believe, the 77 book, until the off record.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of what goes in this is based on who I could get interviews with at the time, and it's funny. I mean, I probably would have wanted to put Sweet Give Us a Wink into the 76 book, but I happened to get him as the 76 book was out, and I just totally love Off the Record as well, so I had two actually interviews with Steve Priest to cover off the record in the next book, but that's coming up. Throw my vote in here. Looking at this list of what's in this second Ye Olde Metal, I would say that the album that stands head and shoulders above everything else here, that nobody kind of, you can argue about all these other albums and point out weaknesses and stuff, but man, the first Montrose album is just flash.
Amen, brother.
Yes.
That thing just sounds like stadium rock right out of the gate. It's better than
the production is one of the best produced albums at its time.
Yeah.
Ted Templeman, I mean, that was groundbreaking. The sound, the tones, everything, amazing.
Yeah,
and I would say cool too that one of the things about it is not only is it groundbreaking, it's also to me one of the 4 or 5 groundbreaking debut albums by this type of band. Yeah. The first ones being, say, the first Zeppelin album, the first Sabbath album, and then the first Montrose album. I mean, to have a band come out and do an album straight out of the gate as classic and as heavy and just fully realized as this.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of people talk about the first Van Halen record as the American rock album, or even Aerosmith. But you look at Van Halen, they took so much from Montrose, not only the producer and Ted Templeman, but the sounds, the tones, the structure, and, kind of funny, Sammy Hagar joining them later. I really think this is the true American rock debut, absolutely.
Neat, yeah.
There's not a weak song on that entire album. And some of those songs are really, really good, but there's a couple on there like Rock Candy and Space Station No. 5 that are just some of the all-time gut thumpers. Those songs are so heavy it defies belief.
And in the words of John Bush, only 8 songs on that album, and that's all you need. You don't need to fill a CD with 15, 16 songs. 8 songs on that record, and that is plenty enough. That album is just, from start to finish, mind-blowing.
Exactly.
It's like when you get your ass kicked for 15 minutes, it hurts really bad, but sometimes when you just get one punch straight in the middle of the forehead, that hurts even more. And that's what the Montrose album is. 8 songs, just smack, and you go, what the hell just hit me?
Yeah, cool. David, do you want to call out any one of these albums for certain praise?
Like John was saying, there's so many in here that are cool, but I'd definitely like to call out Bridge of Sighs. It's Trower's second album. The first album, Twice Removed from Yesterday, is pretty great, and it's got some amazing songs on it, but to me, you get occasionally in time, and especially within a certain artist's career, you get a real alignment of the stars where everything is perfect. The production, the songs, the individual artistry, the musicianship of the guys. And this is another one, too, where there's just not a dead song on that album. And the guitar work is exquisite. It's not just the heavy riffs on the album itself, but if you listen, there's all this guitar work in the background, all this what I would call embroidery.
It's atmospheric. That's the word, man. It's just so much atmosphere in that album,
Yeah, there is. And James Dewar's Stay Up All Night Drinking Whiskey and Smoking Cigarettes voice He's got the most distinctive voice. He's right there with guys like Paul Rodgers and Glenn Hughes as far as that kind of voice.
Absolutely.
And,
very underrated.
Yeah.
Let's
and the
not
songs
forget
are
Davey Pattison, though, eh? Let's not forget Davey Pattison, who is Robert and Trower's singer now and on other albums, and he does an amazing job. He has the similar sort of voice, and he's on some of my favorite albums of all time, Gamma 2 and Gamma 1. I mean, that guy, I saw Trower live recently and for the first time, and it was just unbelievable. It was one of the crispest, greatest, deepest, guttural. Everything was perfect of the sound. It was a power trio. Everybody was playing amazing, and there's Davey Pattison. I mean, he was the reason I went. I had to see that guy sing because he's just got the greatest bluesy voice. I mean, it was just so much firepower. This was a packed, gorgeous club in Buffalo, New York, and wow, what a great night.
You know, another thing about Robert Trower, which many people don't realize now, is just how big he got there for a while in the mid-'70s. I mean, this man who most people remember very little, it's like, oh yeah, that guy, but he was packing huge arenas and outdoor festivals, and he was headlining these shows. That live album that he did a couple of years later, it's just a tremendous tribute to all the power that he's been able to put down on vinyl. But this guy was huge. He was selling out all across the U.S.
David, how about you in this era? What are one or two out of here that leaped out for you?
73, 75, the two Deep Purple albums on here are just hugely influential for me because I was a Purple fan from day one, and when they transitioned from having Ian Gill and Roger Glover in the band to getting David Coverdale, Glenn Hughes, you know, I wondered how they could top the Gillan era. Especially Burn, it was like they opened up the spectrum of what they could do so much with the two vocalists and the vocal harmonies, and also, especially on Burn, with the band getting, I wouldn't say funkier, but getting a little more groove intensive. You know, what we're talking about on a lot of these albums here, what it comes down to, is that the songs themselves are king. And, I mean, all the stuff that we've just talked about, it's the songs that are so great. And on Burn, again, you've almost got one of these, what I call the lining of the stars, where you've just got these supreme musicians, great production, and just these amazing songs. And I love that, and I love Come Taste the Band when Tommy Bolin got in. I'm a huge, huge Tommy Bolin fan. I think that what he brought to the band on the album Come Taste the Band was just what they needed at the time. It's a great album, amazing material, amazing vocals, amazing musicianship. Yeah, just fantastic.
And it's interesting you mentioned that because that's one of my, as Martin will remember from our Deep Purple discussion, one of my favorite Deep Purple records. And Martin, you just put out a book entitled Come Taste the Band, correct?
I called it Getting Tighter from that album.
Getting Tighter, that's right.
Yeah, basically, it's a book that covers the first half of the career, and then I have to write the second half of the career, and then it's basically the German rights for it are sold, and that got me going on doing the self-published version in this, and then I'm going to probably try to figure out English rights at some point. But basically, it's going to be, when it's finished, 500 pages, at same format, chapter as an album, go through the whole thing. It's almost like a Ye Olde Metal just on a band. I mean, that's all these things are. This is the only way I know how to write these books. All the other bios are basically Ye Olde Metals, where it's just all the same band and their records. So this is kind of where we just catch up and have those love-ins, those love letters with, bands that are much smaller, that have a smaller catalog, and just basically get these stories we've all wondered about, kind of thing.
I would like to point out that Martin's even got the chutzpah to put Tommy Bolin on the cover of the book.
Well, I was just going to say that. I like the fact that not only is it called Getting Tighter, which is obviously a track from Come Taste the Band, but you put Tommy Bolin on the book. And I thought because of that, it was the latter Deep Purple years, but it is actually about all of Deep Purple, right, throughout their whole career. Is that correct, Martin?
No, it just ends right there. And then the next book I'm going to pick up with a good dose of Gillan Band to give those guys props, but basically then into Perfect Strangers and up to the present day. So the second one's just the second half of the career.
Well, why did you pick the picture with Tommy Bolin on the cover for that?
Chutzpah, I suppose. I mean, just to do something different. Plus, Rich had some great pictures that a lot of people hadn't seen of Tommy, so there's a few more inside the book as well. But yeah, it was just a great shot. The colors were right. It all blended well. And I just thought, it's just a little different. What the heck?
Well, again, I think one of the most underrated Deep Purple albums, just a great album, Come Taste the Band. One of my favorites, even though I'm a Blackmore fanatic. I would go almost as far to say I like that better than Burn. I definitely like it better than Stormbringer. I was never a big fan of Stormbringer. I just thought Come Taste the Band just had this world-class sound that was very unique and original, and just it really worked for Deep Purple.
Cool.
And it's heavy, too. It may be the heaviest Purple album, too. Some of those songs on there, like Dealer, are just so slab heavy.
Absolutely. And I think really it is one of Martin Popoff's, Martin Birch's best production work.
Mm-hmm.
It just sounds so crystal clear and crisp and crunchy and heavy, but it's got a very blues vibe, almost borderline funk. On certain songs like Getting Tighter, you get a total funk flavor, but there's just so much great chemistry in that record. I think it's magical.
Yeah.
Yep.
A quick survey. I mean, I did put New York Dolls in there. I thought those guys were a good, heavy, daring band for their day. I've got Alice Cooper we put in there. But, of course, yeah, well, I mean, we all love the Montrose album, basically one of the greatest debut albums of all time. And I think it's better than Van Halen 1 in the same vein, but just, sparkling classic start to finish. Nazareth, yeah, got Nazareth in there a couple times.
Hair of the Dog, all-time classic. That's
good, heavy album. You talk about great production, man. Just listening when that, the title track kicks in with the cowbell and stuff. I mean, you cannot record drums better than that. I mean, everybody can argue what they like about a production, but in terms of just getting everything perfect and organic, changing times on there, Miss Misery is so heavy.
Awesome.
Yeah, just great production.
And that was Manny Charlton, correct? That produced that?
Yep.
And he is, again, one of the most underrated, I think, guitarists and producers. He produced a lot of records back in the day, not only Nazareth records, but other records. And he reminds me very much of a Brian May as far as innovativeness. I mean, the guy was really an innovator. You listen to a lot of the Nazareth records, the sounds that comes out of his guitar and just the unique structures and styles that he does is just very, very unique, especially, for the early 70s.
What's great about Nazareth is what a lot of people don't realize, that a lot of their songs are really cover songs. They took old songs, 60s songs, some early 70s songs, and completely converted them into these heavy metal monsters. Beggar's Day was a cover song. Love Hurts was a cover song. This Flight Tonight.
Well, I know that was a Joan Baez song, This Flight Tonight. I didn't know about the other songs.
Yeah, they're all cover. Beggar's Day was a... maybe Martin, you remember who wrote that?
I'm forgetting now. Okay, yeah. That's a dark side of music. That whole side of Hair of the Dog. It really matches that album cover,
And Please Don't Judas Me, again, a very unique song. Metallica had covered that song. I don't know if you actually heard that.
Oh, wow.
I don't even know where it's from, but it's on YouTube as some special, like an acoustic thing, and they cover Please Don't Judas Me, which I thought was really unique.
Garage Days Volume 6.
For sure.
One thing I want to bring up, and I want to get all your opinions about this. You mentioned the New York Dolls, and I lump them in with bands like the Sex Pistols, the Clash, the Ramones, and even Kiss to some extent.
No. This is Ted here being an asshole. No, I wouldn't do that. Definitely not the punk stuff. I would lump them in more with Mott the Hoople and Bowie and the Sweet and the early glam stuff. Definitely not the punk stuff.
I don't get it. I mean, I listened to the Dolls, and I remember first seeing the New York Dolls on TV when I was a kid. They were on the show called The Real Don Steele Show. I don't know if any of you remember that.
Yep.
Remember that? It was
I remember that.
About 6 p.m. at night. I was a kid, and all the other shows were at like 1 in the morning, like Don Kirshner's rock concert or Midnight Special. They never had hard rock bands during like dinner time. But on this show, The Real Don Steele, I saw the New York Dolls come out. And I'm thinking, wow, long-haired guys. And even back then, I go, this is shit. And even today, I still say the same thing. And I know so many people that love the New York Dolls, and I don't get it. I just think they were crap. Okay, innovative, yes. They did something different, just like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols. I give those bands respect, and I give Kiss the respect for starting the whole, live show. But song-wise, you cannot compare these bands to the greats like the Zeppelins, Purples, and all that. And when people consider that, especially the Ramones, and I totally respect the Ramones, but how many songs do they have? They have maybe 4 songs you could remember. All the rest of their songs sound like other songs. But people like idiots from Rolling Stone magazine or Spin say they're the greatest rock band ever. You can't compare them to AC/DC or Zeppelin or any of these other bands.
I think very, very different bands with very different styles and different genres of music. I mean, personally, I love the first New York Dolls album. That first album is so great because the songs are so cool. Every single song on there is cool. The ability, the technical ability of those guys, when you put them against Deep Purple and Montrose and Nazareth and everybody else, the technical ability is definitely lacking. But the songs are so cool. Frankenstein, Personality Crisis, Looking for a Kiss. Vietnamese Baby is an amazing song.
It's cool in like a novelty way. It's cool because it's kind of different. And it's just fun. Like the Ramones, they have some great songs. You know, they're just fun rock and roll songs. But are they classics?
35 years after that.
I feel the same way about the Stooges.
Oh, no. The Stooges are so great, it defies words.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I'll throw in my little piece on the New York Dolls. I mean, I agree that they come from a little more of a glam thing, but they also come from a real New York girl group, doo-wop, singing, garage band thing, which is very complex, very cool, very Lou Reed. I mean, Kiss definitely doesn't have that. Kiss and BTO have kind of almost more in common. Kiss and Foghat. I mean, there's boogie structures in there. The Dolls have Rolling Stones going for them. Technical ability is an interesting case with those guys because they got a lot of abuse for being really sloppy live because they did a lot of drugs and stuff. But those 2 records are actually fairly complexly arranged. The takes they got are very good, and they're both produced really good. So if you haven't heard the press and seen them live or whatever, you know, those albums sound pretty damn competent, and I really like them. I mean, they're just loaded with personality, and they're loaded with heavy riffs. I mean, there's a lot of heavy riffs on that first one, less so on the second one. But just a lot of good ear candy going on all over the place, and just I'll just jump right in here on the Stooges as well. I mean, I think those guys are amazing and classic as well, although the first 2 are pretty crude and caveman-like, although Raw Power is just a classic start to finish. It's so squalid and heavy and dark and druggy and great riffs.
What songs do you remember? I Want to Be Your Dog. That's a great song. How many? All the others are just kind of, blah. I thought.
The first album is pretty rudimentary. The second album's pretty rudimentary. But Raw Power actually has some complexity and class to it. I think it's a pretty cool album. And those New York Dolls. I mean, I just never get tired of those albums. There's just so much going on them.
I think the word I would use in describing the first New York Dolls album, or the word that comes to mind, is abandon. Is that it's the kind of thing that I put on, and when nobody's home, and I jump around the living room and play air guitar to it, it's just so much fun.
But David, are you in your underwear, or are you purely naked when you jump around and play air guitar? That's the question.
Well, it depends. If I'm playing the vinyl, then I'm definitely naked. If I'm playing the CD, I may have my underwear and my socks on. Yeah.
Very good. Very good. I'm more of a European metal fan. What about you, Strednansky? What's your view on that whole New York kind of scene?
I never got into it again. That's the part that never really trickled through to Europe as much. New York Dolls, I saw them on Don Kirshner's rock concert. You mentioned they were on like 1 o'clock in the morning, and I did stay up that night and I watched them, and they were cool, and I decided to pick up the record, but never really became a huge fan. However, I thought one album that I wanted to mention, and I know I exchanged some emails with Martin on this one, is an album that wasn't mentioned in the book, but a band called Hustler put out an album in 1975 called Play Loud.
They're an LA band, right?
I don't even know. No, they're British. They're an English band.
They're a British band, yeah.
This came out on SM Records, and it was produced by Roy Thomas Baker. At the same time, doing the Queen, the Queen records, and it is an extremely heavy yet commercially accessible hard rock album, very similar to what Sweet were doing in some way. I mean, you listen to songs like Strange Love or Moneymaker on that, And what fantastic songs. And it's a record that probably not too many people have heard about, but you're looking at the credentials and the sound and some of the songs that are on there, these guys should have been huge.
I must say that the last song on that album, which is called Night Creeper, is one of the greatest songs I have ever heard.
Really? I'll have to check that out.
I'll pull that out and play it again.
Back to the New York scene, one band that you did include, which I thought was really cool, is the Dictators. You included their record, which of course was Ross the Boss, pre-Manowar.
Yeah, I put them in the 75 book. I put their next album in the 77 book, and then the new one that's coming out next week, 78, I've got Blood Brothers. And Blood Brothers, I just think, is probably in my top 5 or 6 albums of all time. I've always had that way up my list. I just think that thing just bleeds metal, bleeds New York, bleeds punk rock, yelling, just girl groups, 60s, traditions. Top 10 from that band is just, and so is Andy. They're just big old time rock and roll fans, and everything on that album pretty much is heavy. I mean, it's a good heavy rockin' album. But yeah, I just love those guys. But that's my favorite. The 77 Manifest Destiny is slightly less so, and then Go Girl Crazy is my least favorite of the 3. And and they continue to make albums later. I mean, they have basically two more albums, but I mean, Blood Brothers is just a balls out classic.
Were there any other bands from that era that you feel were underground classics that Martin may have left off in his books?
There were some of them. Believe it or not, there was a band called Nuts, N-U-T-Z.
Didn't you include them in one of your books, Nuts?
No, that's Nitzinger later, but Nuts, okay. I know who Nuts is, of course, yeah, and then they turned into Rage later on, right?
Yeah, Bootleggers on Metal for
Nuts. That they did of Bob Dylan's One More Cup of Coffee that is just an incredible. It reminded me of what Nazareth did to when they covered old folk songs and kind of underground songs. What Nuts did with One More Cup of Coffee is amazing. The dynamic range, the power, the vocal performance on that is something to really listen to.
If I could mention a couple albums, I thought you neglected one of my all-time favorite underground records of all that time, and I think one of the truly first real progressive rock metal albums was the first Armageddon record, which was, I believe, in 1975.
Yeah.
An amazing
record. Love that album. Actually, I hear it on XM all the time on Deep Tracks. They play songs. Wow. Yeah, there's somebody on there who likes that album.
Yeah, I almost included that. I couldn't find Bobby Caldwell again to have an interview. I mean, I was going to talk to him about it. I couldn't find him. I had some other footage. That is a good album. I mean, and they only made the one album, and it is a very strange. It's Budgie-like. It almost reminds me of Budgie. I mean, they were both on A&M Records over here. But it is progressive and off the wall and weird with long songs that have unpredictable things going on. It's heavy, but it arrives at its heaviness from a whole different world, and that's where sometimes you get the greatest heavy metal. When these guys aren't thinking heavy metal, but they love the tools of heavy metal and the riffs and stuff, and they throw it all into their weird off-the-wall way of making music, and that's how you get these strange classics.
What everyone considers like Dream Theater to start the heavy metal progressive sound, where most bands were, either progressive or metal. I think Armageddon were the first to really combine the two. I wouldn't even go so far as to the early Rush was like that. I think this first Armageddon record...
I would go one step for that and say that the originator of that is the first Captain Beyond album.
Actually, that's exactly what I was going to mention. I think it's Bobby Caldwell, himself, that kind of was taking his music in that direction with both Captain Beyond and Armageddon.
Agreed.
I would give that argument more so if I had to pick one band, I would pick Rush. Because they were at it, they were so good at it. They were always doing it, except for the first album. You look at 75, they had Caress of Steel and Fly By Night. So basically, there you go. I think that's really the big stamp in terms of saying progressive and metal, combine them, here you go.
What the fuck was the singer's name from the Yardbirds, Armageddon?
Keith
Relf. And now the reason they only did one record, on their tour, the first and only Armageddon tour, that was when he died. He got electrocuted on stage, correct?
Yep. No, he got electrocuted at home rehearsing, fooling around with his plugs. He had really bad wiring, and he was wiring this and that and shoving stuff straight into the straight into the sockets and things, and he was just fiddling around at home with his own
Are you
rehearsal
sure?
gear.
I thought it was like a rainstorm. I thought they did an outdoor concert and it was a rainstorm and he died.
No.
No, Martin's correct.
You know, I read that once or twice, and then I had Chris Draja himself tell me the story.
And if I could
From the
mention a
Yardbirds.
couple other albums that you neglected, and I guess this would be in your first book, and I know Strednansky could back this up, is you didn't include the first Lucifer's Friend album, which I thought was an all-time classic for 1973 or 72?
One, I believe.
Oh, 71, that's right. And Alex Harvey Band. You didn't have any sensational Alex Harvey Band records. It's funny, when they came out, when I discovered them, I hated them. I heard some of the records, I thought this was crap. But now I think they are the most unique, amazing band around, the sensational Alex Harvey Band. Listening back to their stuff, seeing that their debut came out in I believe 73. I mean, totally original band. What?
Yeah, it's neat stuff for further study. There's definitely a lot of good music there, that's for sure.
But those were the artists I thought you probably neglected. What about you, David? Was there any classics that you felt should have been in the book?
From the early 70s, I would certainly give a nod to Atomic Rooster, especially the Death Walks Behind You album. Love that album. Boy, what else? There's so much stuff. There really is so much stuff. It's an amazingly fertile period for great, heavy, hard rock music.
Yeah. Do you want to move on to 76?
Let's do it.
And the thing that's most about 76 is where the heck is Rainbow Rising?
That's right.
Well, as I say in the intro to these books, I don't include anything I've written a whole book on. That's why.
But Rainbow Rising is truly my second all-time favorite record, and that was immediately I noticed that its absence. Because overall, I think 1976 was kind of a transitional year. I think that, there was punk was becoming more and more prominent, that the California easy listening sound of the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac was becoming more and more prominent. It seemed like hard rock had kind of a weird spot. It didn't really know where to fit. Now, having said that, if you look at some of the records that you do talk about, the debut album from Stars, the Scorpions' Virgin Killer, obviously the first Boston album, Ted Nugent's Free For All with Meatloaf singing on there, which a lot of people don't know either. I mean, some great records did come out that year, but Rainbow Rising stands above them all.
Yeah, well, Meatloaf only did on one of the tracks. It's mostly Derek St. Holmes singing on that record, correct? I mean, Ted does the vocals on Free For All. I think Meatloaf is only on one or two tracks. Is that correct?
He's on Hammer Down. I think I Love You So I Told You a Lie, perhaps. Yeah. The story there is, I mean, for that particular chapter in that book, that chapter is one of the longest one I've written, and for that I talked to Cliff, Derek, Ted, and Rob. I talked to the whole band for that. I even got a little bit of Tom Werman in there, but the whole thing is Derek was a real firecracker and got into a lot of trouble all the time, and butting heads with the producers, and butting heads with Ted. We know Ted is a real hothead himself and strong-willed. But basically, Derek was like more than once. I mean, he fired, and then they got Meatloaf in to sing his stuff, and then they said, "Where's that voice? Where's the Derek voice?" So they had to, the label was saying, so they had to haul Derek back and sing some more. So essentially, Ted sings a third, Derek sings a third, and Meatloaf sings a third, more or less, of that record. And I think it's just a fantastic album, so well paced. Great modern metal heavy riffs, but American stadium rock style heavy riffs on that. Okay, if we're going to go by our rule of mentioning one album or whatever that stands out, I'm gonna break it and mention two: Angel Hell of a Band and Teaze. A lot of people don't know that Teaze album. It was an indie released Canadian band from Windsor. That album is heavy start to finish and very accomplished, and it's one of the main driving reasons that I love doing this series. When I find something and I really want to proselytize about it, that album is so classy and heavy and well done. It was recorded in about a day or 2 days. It is a big rock and bold stadium rock album, and it's a debut. Everybody should check that one out. But my favorite on that list, my favorite probably 3 bands of all time right now, or 4 bands, are Deep Purple, Gillan, Max Webster, and ZZ Top. And the Max Webster debut is an amazing album there. But I think the best album on that list in every way is Angel Hell of a Band. That thing is so incredibly crunchy produced. It's progressive, it's heavy, it's got the organ, it's got a soaring vocal. It's that band, I just can't believe they weren't bigger, because that album is just absolutely skilled.
That album, I mean, the thing about Angel is it seems like the band couldn't figure out which direction they wanted to go. It's not focused. And I think that was so many of the bands that could have been great. And I think that's a reason why they didn't have either those hit songs or just the album rock. I mean, they were obviously a great live band, but song-wise, they just didn't focus. Like you say, it was all over the place. They tried to be progressive, and sometimes then they tried to be a commercial rock band, and they weren't great at any one thing, but they tried to do so many different things to please so many people. And I think with so many bands from the 70s that were doing that, bands like Detective, Piper, all these albums that were okay, but there wasn't a certain focus, and they weren't great classics like the Aerosmith, Montrose, or even Riot for that matter. And I think that was another band you neglected to mention. One of the greatest American hard rock metal bands is Riot. I mean, their first album, Narita. You talk about Stars, all these other bands. I don't think Stars was very focused either. I mean, Riot, they were just dead on, man. That was, I mean, I think even more so than the first Van Halen record. They were like the first new breed of American metal. They're right up there with the first Montrose record. But some of these other albums you mentioned, Moxie, Teaze, I've had these records, but they just didn't have the impact of a band like, say, a Riot.
That was quite a rant, huh?
I mean, my point is there's a certain reason why some of these bands never made it. And you mentioned a band like Angel that had everything in its place. They had the management, they had, Casablanca, they had the amazing live show, but they never had a hit song. And there has to be something more than just business practices, I think, that held a lot of these bands back. Stars is another one.
I would actually agree with you on several of these. Some of them not so much, but I certainly understand what you're saying about Angel being a little prog, little heavy, little commercial with the Rascals cover and that sort of thing. And I think some of these guys, you're right, they did lack a little bit of focus, whereas the really great epic bands were really like diamond hard, knew what they wanted, and that's what they did, and they didn't do anything else. They didn't screw around with anything else.
What are your thoughts, Strednansky?
This was about the time when I really became kind of grew up out of that phase I was mentioning earlier. I was soaking everything up, became kind of a stuck-up metal authority. And you know how us kids were at the time. If this was mainstream, we didn't like it. So I was looking for those obscure bands, and that's why I'm glad that Martin mentioned a record like the Teaze record. I was into those guys too, and when you were the guy that could talk about a band nobody else heard of, and then when you played it to a group of people and everybody agreed that this is really good stuff, that just made you really proud. So I was into some of those lesser known bands. Angel, the one that we talked about, I know, Martin, you said how much you liked them, but to me, Trower from their first album, opening song, awesome. First blew me away, have not topped that song since.
I think that was their best album, their debut.
Do you guys know the Rex album? That was another one where I just totally wanted to write about those guys and find, I mean, it was hard getting an interview with Rex Smith, but I got Rex, I got Orville, I got the drummer Mike, and who actually sent me the hand-done bass drum head, which I've got hanging on the wall in my office here. But those guys I wanted to write about because they were one of those, they only made 2 albums, they were both quite heavy, and I did the second one in 1977. But they were in that whole stable with the whole, I mean, my first big concert was Rex, Bebop Deluxe, and Ted Nugent, and they were on Columbia. And that album basically is heavy start to finish. It sounds like, not as well written, but it basically sounds like an Aerosmith album. Do you guys know that record?
Absolutely, both of them, yeah. Can't Get Out of Here. What was the name of the second one? Something.
Where Do We Go From Here?
Where Do We Go From Here, yeah. And there's one other band that is completely unknown, and I don't think I've ever been able to find a CD reissue, not even a fake CD reissue, but it was the band Trigger that ended up with Rocksteady Management, came out of New York. Discovery either by one of the KISS guys or from that organization, but a great record that just completely disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
Jumping to the 77 book, there's a band you mentioned in there, which I thought were a great L.A. band. Pre-Van Halen, the band Legs Diamond. A diamond is a hard rock. And they were actually signed, I believe that was a major label. They had a couple major labels. They were like Quiet Riot with Randy Rhoads. They were big in Japan. I know they had a couple Japanese imports back in the time. And in L.A., they just didn't make an impact. But a great album, Diamond is a Hard Rock. And Moxie, I do like the Riding High record. I do thought that was a great record. And another band you mentioned is Gatto. And I always got them confused with the Gods. But who was Gatto again?
Gatto was a three-piece from Canada. This first album is very heavy. I mean, it's quite heavy. I think all you guys would like it. You've probably heard it. But basically, that is a very heavy record from 77. The second one's less heavy. The third one's even less heavy. And then they have sporadic albums later. But basically, this one is quite good. The Gods, I actually have a very long chapter on those guys in the 78 book. But yeah, Gatto was just a local, didn't do much. They were on Polydor. Canada. I don't even know if that thing came out in the States, frankly. But it's a good album, heavy. It's a gatefold, big, powerful, rocks and boulders front cover. And the lead singer, Greg Godovitz, real character, but he looked like Woody Allen. He looked like a little librarian type, short hair and glasses. It was pretty funny. But that album, you guys would find that heavy. It's much heavier than many of these on all of these lists, actually.
You also mentioned, obviously Moxie's Riding High, a great band. But one thing, again, people don't understand, and David, I wasn't sure. You're such a big Tommy Bolin fan, but Tommy Bolin did play on the first album for Moxie.
Yeah,
and to me that is still a standout. And in so many ways, back in the 70s, it seemed like debut albums, for me, always stood out as often as the best records of bands' careers.
Yeah.
Yeah. I always tell people, this is sort of one of my standard lines right now, is that I'm 52, and the bad news is that my knees hurt like hell, but the good news is that I saw most of these bands we're talking about.
Yeah.
and a lot of them were like, even in like theaters, they weren't headline band in theaters. They were second on the bill to a headline band. And I saw Moxie, saw Angel. Who else we were just talking about? The Point Blank, and a lot of these guys. They were really good bands. I think a lot of them, the reason that they never sort of made it to the next level is they never had the one song that was real super distinctive. And Legs Diamond especially comes to mind with regards to that. There was never like the one song that you can go to, like even guys like us, and say, name the big Legs Diamond song, and you go, it could be.
A Diamond is a Hard Rock. That was a catchy number.
It was Stage Fright for me.
That's a good one too. But you mentioned a great point, John, about the debut records, and you got to remember this is the 70s, and to catapult a band back there, you needed that formulated radio hit, and that's what all the bands were going for. And I thought, you take for instance the first Montrose, the debut Montrose record, they could never emulate that. The second record was Paper Money, and it seemed like, I don't know if it was the record label or if it was Ronnie Montrose himself, but that album was completely second rate compared to the debut, and it seemed like they were pushing so hard for a radio hit. I mean, sure, you had your monsters like I Got the Fire and whatever, but it seemed like a lot of the bands back in that era, they would do a great debut, and then it would seem like the record company would come in and say, okay, you made your impact now with the debut, now we got to get that radio hit. The second or third records always seem a lot more formulated.
Yeah,
well,
sure.
Like John was saying, these bands become sort of less heavy, and it definitely around 76 does change. I mean, you've got the start of what the whole corporate rock thing was, right? With bands like Boston, and then Fleetwood Mac, Peter Frampton, Foreigner, all these type of bands. And they sort of were based on a formula. A lot of them were real good musicians with real good songs, but definitely the whole thing, the industry starts to change.
Yeah, interesting. And we all remember this era as the big sort of stadium rock era, the outdoor festivals. Yeah. I mean, that's just the first thing that comes to mind, California Jam or something, right? And, the big epic bands, the big Columbia bands. And, one that is on here that I think is a great album, and I've got a very long chapter on is Derringer's Sweet Evil, and he felt that way the whole time. Him and Frank Marino are like bookends. They're guitar guys who, they have different things they wanted to do, but they both felt pressured by that whole Leber Krebs kind of Aerosmith, Ted Nugent caught up in the whole thing. We want you guys to be like these guys so you can make a lot of money. And Derringer, went mellow right after Sweet Evil. Frank Marino kind of alienated himself from the industry a little, but Rick did not want to be this way. Ronnie Montrose did not want to be like that first album. He wanted to keep exploring and doing weird things. I mean, you ask who did that? It was Ronnie that changed that band.
Yeah, well, you listen
Sammy
to
and Ronnie were fighting.
Yeah.
He wanted to write a certain way. He wanted to be experimental. He wanted to sing songs. He wanted instrumentals. So it's the same sort of thing. Rick Derringer did not want to be a metal guy. Frank Marino didn't. Ronnie Montrose didn't.
Well, I think one of the greatest live metal records is the Derringer Live. Very, very underrated. I know you're not a big live record fan, but you listen to what, like you said, what Derringer became. He became more of a pop rock kind of guy, almost like a Rick Springfield kind of guy. You listen to the Derringer Live record, Beyond the Universe, and even the guitar solos and Rock and Roll Hoochie Coo. I mean, that was just a balls out metal record.
I got good news for you, and I'm going to send you a live Derringer bootleg that I have from around the time of Sweet Evil that's a full 80 minutes long that absolutely leaves the official live album in the dust.
Really?
Wow, that's amazing, huh?
I want it.
If you like that live album, you will wet yourself when you hear this.
Of course, we know that the original band reformed and they went out and toured, which was just amazing to see. I got to see them in Buffalo and hang out and small, nice venue, not a lot of people there, but they basically played all these great hits we loved. I mean, it was the exact same four guys. It was just amazing to see.
Vinny Appice actually was the drummer on the live record, right?
Yeah, and Sweet Evil, yeah.
And Sweet Evil too, yeah. Wow.
Billy Aronson from Dust was playing bass.
That's right. The guitar player was, he played with Axe with Vinny
Alcatraz and Steppenwolf, Danny Johnson.
Danny Johnson. He was also in an old L.A. band, local band. It was either Stormer or one of those old.
Yeah, you're right.
LA
you're
bands.
right.
Yeah.
And again, let's not forget that Axe album that he did with Vinny. That is an amazing album.
I got to pull that out again.
You mentioned one of the one-hit wonders. Like one that comes to mind is Ram Jam. Everyone remembers the song Black Betty, but I remember hearing that album, and I remember actually buying the single for Black Betty when it became a radio hit, and that was a huge radio hit at the time. But I remember hearing the album. I don't even remember it. It was so long ago. What were they, a heavy band?
My God, that album, A Portrait of the Artist as the Young Ram, is actually also in my top 5 or 6 albums ever. That album is the heaviest album from an American band, I think, more or less in the 70s. And they just completely transformed themselves. That story in Ye Olde Metal 78 will blow your mind. It's the best story because the lead singer ended up going to jail for drugs. He's now an insurance guy and a prison pastor. The great guy, Mike Scavone. And just hearing what went on with putting that record together.
It was one record, right? It was on Epic, I remember.
Well, they had the Ram Jam record, which was kind of like a boogie rock, old, dated, heavy enough, but kind of like a Foghat BTO thing. The second one is almost like, few of those songs could have been Judas Priest songs, like riffy, complicated Judas Priest songs, because Jimmy Santoro, they got this guitarist in, and the guys wanted another Aerosmith. They said, write like Aerosmith. And it's way heavier than Aerosmith. And it is dirty and wild and loud. And literally, I think there's maybe 9 songs on it. 7 of them are metal. One of them has a cool metal part in it. It reminds me of Sweet Evil in a way. That album is an absolute masterpiece, and literally, it's one of my top 10 albums. I play it all the time, and that again is one of the things driving this series. Like when I can write about an album like that I just totally, absolutely love, and it has a crazy story behind it because those guys were ripped off left, right, and center. That album, I mean, just to tell you briefly, I mean, they were, the main guitarist, the leader of the band, was writing a whole separate album just in the next room over to what Jimmy Santoro was told to kind of do, write a heavy album. And they basically wrote 2 albums worth of material, and they said, well, we want the heavy stuff. So they put that out. There is absolutely nothing about the sound of those two albums that is remotely similar. They sound like two completely different bands.
Wow.
Oh, it's just balls out rock and heavy. It's called Portrait of the Artist of the Young Ram.
Off topic, have you heard the remake of Black Betty that the Australian band Spiderbait did?
Yeah, that was cool. That was right on.
I thought it was a absolutely brilliant, heavy remake.
I'm looking forward to talking about Max Webster here because I know that Martin worships these guys, and I'm a major, major fan of this band. I saw them back at, like I said, 52 Bad Knees, but I saw Max Webster a whole bunch of times back in the 70s. They were a great band, just a wild, wild, amazing band.
Did they come to America a lot? Because I don't remember them even being popular at all in the States. Were they?
I'll tell you their story. Briefly, their story is this. I mean, they are considered the baby Rush, and they toured with Rush more than any band. They were on the same label, same management.
Didn't Neil Peart idolize them? He was a huge fan of theirs.
Well, him and Gary McCracken, the drummer, were good buddies. But basically, Max Webster is another progressive metal band in a way, but they also have a very cool thing in that they have some of the greatest lyrics you've ever heard, and they have, like Grateful Dead, they have like an external lyricist, Pi Dubois, which is, he looks like Jerry Garcia. He's this little kind of mystic, kind of very poetic guy. He wrote most of the lyrics, almost all of them. And basically, Max Webster were like a keyboardy, slightly accessible version of a progressive metal band, but they were also Zappa-esque, if you can believe it. I mean, just incredible, incredible situation. I mean, the mix of what they did. Terry Brown produced the albums to incredible high-fidelity standards. They only made, 5 studio albums and 1 live album and a greatest hits album. Yeah, exactly. I mean, they are in my top 4 favorite bands of all time because every single one of those records is a 10 in my books. Great band. Check them out.
What about you, Strednansky?
There's 3 records that stand out for me from 1977 that aren't talked about a lot. One is the Slade album, Whatever Happened to Slade. You know, Slade kind of became known for their hit singles, the Come On Feel the Noise, Goodbye to Jane, very European. But on Whatever Happened to Slade, they decided to go heavy. It's probably the heaviest album that I ever made, moved away from that approach to just recording singles and created just a great record. Also, one thing that should be mentioned is that Pat Travers put out his debut album in 1977. What a great record that was. To be followed by, Making Magic, which was, I think the Making Magic came out in 1977, which I think was the strongest album that.
Yeah, you're right. That's 77. The first one's 76. I actually cover.
Putting It Straight? Was Putting It Straight after Making Magic?
Correct. Putting It Straight was his third one.
Life in London, still one of what I think one of the greatest rock songs. And that was Nico McBrain on those records playing drums,
Yep.
But before, last but not least, I really want to mention a band from Japan that maybe opened this up for a lot of these Japanese. Bow Wow.
That was what I was thinking of mentioning. Thank you, Strednansky, for bringing that up.
Yeah, the first album came out as far back as 74, but Signal Fire, check out the song titles: Rainbow of Sabbath, Silver Lightning, just Signal Fire, Rock and Roll Drive. It was just a great rock and roll record. And Kyoji Yamamoto, the guitar player, he was a huge fan of Jimi Hendrix and Richie Blackmore, and you really heard that come through on a lot of the Bow Wow records. It became, semi-big in the 80s during the whole new wave of British heavy metal scene. But I think what they did, they really opened up and created that whole Japanese heavy metal scene that then flourished later on.
Silver Lightning, the riff in that song is just unbelievable.
A couple albums I'd like to mention from this era certainly aren't on these lists here, and that would be the first couple of UFO albums.
Oh, yes.
To me, maybe those first 3 albums with Schenker are as good as any of the later stuff that they did, either Obsession or Lights Out. There's some great songs on those first 3 albums, and I certainly don't have to tell you guys what I'm talking about. And the other album I want to mention specifically is Judas Priest's Sad Wings of Destiny, which came out, I believe, in 75.
Right.
6, yeah.
That album just absolutely knocked me sideways when it came out because we were going in this transition phase into more commercial, corporate kind of hard rock. And out came this band that was just purely full-blown heavy metal when it wasn't particularly trendy to be like that at the time. And obviously having songs like Victim of Changes and Ripper and Dreamer Deceiver on there, that's a great album. Great album.
Yeah.
And Martin, the reason why I guess you didn't include these were because you were going for more of an underground?
No, really clear reason for those ones is that I didn't want to put anything that I've written an entire book on. So no Priest, no Rainbow, no UFO, no Sabbath and that, because literally it would just be stealing a chapter from one of those books and shoving it in this Ye Olde Metal thing.
Right.
So there's none, the odd thing happened where, I did put 2 Deep Purple chapters in here, and now I'm doing a Deep Purple book, but I'm not doing any reverse. So yeah, there's, some of the biggest, most important albums are not in here, and that's because, well, the main reason is that. Other reasons is basically, I can't get the interviews. I mean, I haven't interviewed Robert Plant and Jimmy Page, so, never. So that's why Physical Graffiti isn't in there, which I think is maybe the greatest album of all time.
Oh, yeah, we've talked about that one.
Probably my number 1 album ever,
Yeah.
So basically, it was, who can I track down? It's a mix of famous albums, unfamous albums, but, just a lot of it comes down to those burning questions we've had for decades, wondering what the heck went on and really what drove that. The one that was the most, driving questions would have been the 2 Rex albums and the 2 Ram Jam albums, I would say. I mean, I've always wondered about those bands. What the heck is their deal? Because there was so little press on either of them.
Right.
And, Bob, when you just go listen to that Ram Jam album, it will just knock you off your feet.
I am going to check that out.
It's so heavy.
Now, going back really just to touch up on a couple of the titles and some of the books that we didn't mention, a band that I never got into until kind of recently, Sir Lord Baltimore, who actually reformed, and someone else we haven't talked about, of course, Uriah Heep. We did a whole podcast on Uriah Heep, but the Look at Yourself album, a classic. Humble Pie Smokin', a band out of Australia that I never heard called Buffalo. And then, of course, you have a Budgies album, which I thought was kind of weird, is you had, what was the album you put in there?
Bandolier, really heavy album.
Right, right. And
great production, too.
You want to briefly touch up on some of those records or any of the other records that you think we might have neglected from all these eras before we close this thing?
I'll let someone else handle whatever they want, and then I'll just deal with the one that's missing kind of thing. Go ahead.
Can I give you one of the greatest one-off albums of all time that we missed?
Yes,
and that is the one and only Ursa Major album.
Who?
Yeah.
Well, what's the
Ursa
band?
Major, Dick Wagner.
His band was his outfit.
This is
Never heard of
Wagner did 3 albums with a group called The Frost out of Detroit, and then he did this one album with this group Ursa Major, and then he joined Lou Reed's band, and then he joined Cooper's band. This Ursa Major album is one of the greatest things you will ever hear in your entire life.
Wow.
It's also the first production job by a young guy named Bob Ezrin.
By the way, the Frost albums, the heaviest and best one is the one with the really fey-looking album cover, right? With the pinky kind of picture of the guys and a dumb title. I can't remember the name of it, but basically, the heaviest Frost album is the one that looks like it totally wouldn't be the heaviest.
Through the Eyes of Love, the third album.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There's another band you mentioned that I'm not familiar with, and I remember seeing their album titles around the band Dirty Tricks.
Yeah, their situation, they just made 3 albums. All of them are pretty heavy. Not the greatest, songs or skilled or even the production, but they were just a good, heavy UK band. Their interesting situation right now is that I believe it's all 4 of the original guys have what is considered the UK's greatest Led Zeppelin tribute band.
That opening song, Wait Till Saturday, another one of those opening songs of the first album, kind of like Angel's Tower, that just blows you away, though. And that's what kind of stuck with me. However, Martin, you're right. The rest of the stuff from that point on was more mediocre than to really stand out.
Yeah.
And another band I was wondering why you didn't include in the first chapter was Amandul.
Well, those guys really don't have one seriously heavy album. They were a kraut rock, prog rock, neat band. interesting dual male-female vocals, very strange foreign melodies that sound like they would be like a Japanese band or a Ukrainian band or something. Some really cool, strange stuff with that band. But they really are not in this sort of realm at all, I would say.
Another one that David mentioned, and I never got so much, but always people considered classic, was Atomic Rooster. Why were they not included?
Yeah, I've just never had the interviews, but I almost went to pursue that. Another one I went to pursue, but I got lazy in the end or whatever, was Stray. I could have put one or two different Stray albums in, and I almost talked to those guys as well.
You like them a lot, Strednansky, right? Or was
the Strife album was very good. They were. There were another one of those bands that Bob Gamber from that record store introduced me to. Never really got that much into it. If anything, I would compare Stray to like Spooky Tooth. And Spooky Tooth had some really cool heavy tunes too, and I know nobody mentioned them. Better By You, Better Than Me, the Judas Priest cover, that was an original Spooky Tooth song.
That's right.
So some great stuff there. Stray was so-so with me.
What was the band Straw Dog? Remember them?
Stray Dog.
Or was it Stray Dog?
Stray Dog.
Yeah, I used to get them mixed up all the time.
Stray. That's
and I don't think they were a heavy band at all. Okay. Another one like Trigger that was pretty good was Strider. Another heavy band that people forget about. Here, I'll name you a couple. Diamond Rio had a real heavy album. I think it was 1977. A band called Rockkicks, Rockicks, and a band called Illusion. Those were all, I believe, major label American bands from the late 70s who made pretty damn heavy albums. They didn't look like heavy albums at all.
Illusion, but weren't they on Geffen in the early 80s?
Yeah, well, I think this is a late 70s album, the one I'm thinking of.
The Illusion band, are they from Long Island?
Yes, I believe so, and not to be confused with The Illusion. This is a late 70s just Illusion. Yeah, check that Diamond Rio album out. They look like they are not rocking at all on that album. They have like a couple albums, and I think it's their second one, and it might actually be called A Diamond is a Hard Rock. It is a good, solid, heavy album.
We should also mention Widowmaker, who had two records out on Jet Records. I think that was one of the early releases on that label that Sharon Osbourne's father started.
Yeah, Don Arden. Yeah.
Widowmaker with Ariel Bender, who came out of Mott the Hoople. A couple of pretty solid records there. And speaking of Mott the Hoople, no mention at all throughout all of this of Mott the Hoople. I think it's some fantastic records out. Maybe they were a little too much on the glam side, but some of their records were pretty heavy.
There's a couple bands I want to mention that I've heard so much about that I actually never heard. A French band called Shaken Street.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Were they heavy, or what was their whole deal?
The second album was very American-sounding because Ross the Boss was in the band for the second one, and it was on an American label. It's actually a pretty good, catchy, street-level album. The first one, I believe, was much more varied, but it had their heaviest song. I think it was Vampire Rock, perhaps?
Yeah.
But yeah, big, real heavy, like almost like Montrose Matriarch kind of song.
Oh wow!
Yeah, it was really good. So they had two albums, and they were vastly different from each other.
It was a chick singer, right?
Yeah, it was Fabienne Stein, who actually is still around and doing pop songs in her native France. That was her name.
Now, speaking of France bands, I know that this was a little bit later, but Trust. I guess their debut was out in '79, so I guess that would be a little bit later. But of course, one of the great bands.
Here, I'll give you guys a little sneak peek. Here's what's going into 1978. I mean, this is out next week, but The Hounds Unleashed, Frank Marino, Mahogany Rush Live, Stars Attention Shoppers, Yesterday and Today Struck Down, Teaze on the Loose, Ram Jam Portrait of the Artist, Dictators, Blood Brothers, The Boys, Too Wild to Tame, The Gods, Dead Boys, We Have Come for Your Children, I threw some punk in, DMZ, Street Heart, Meanwhile Back in Paris, Six Pieces of Eight, Your Eye Heap, Fallen Angel, Pat Travers, Heat in the Street, and Stars Coliseum Rock.
Very cool.
We get next time,
So should we close this up now, or was there anything? I know that this carried on quite some time, huh?
Yeah, it's easy just pulling bands out of it. Another one we left out, the Runaways. They were a good rock and heavy band. 76, 77, and 78.
It's interesting when they recently did it the top 100 best songs of all hard rock songs of all time. They actually had Cherry Bomb on that list. This is fantastic, Martin. I really appreciate your books. They're right next to my bed on the nightstand, and I keep flipping through them all the time. And
right on.
But I look forward to discussing your next set of books as you approach the 80s.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, well, we'll get maybe a couple out, and we'll jump in there again. So 79's kind of even half done now. So.
All right. So MartinPopoff.com is where you could order the books, correct, Martin?
Yeah. They're all described there. It tells you what's in each one. Like I say, each one of them's pretty much exactly 250 pages. A lot of good rare photos, and 1978 is out in about a week.
Awesome. Guys, it was a pleasure.
All right. We'll talk to you later.
All right, guys.
Hold on.
Well, there you have it. The Ye Olde Martin podcast featuring Martin Popoff, John Strednansky, and David Tedds. Many thanks to the three of them, and be sure to check out Martin Popoff's Ye Olde Metal book series. You can purchase each of the 5 volumes on his website, www.martinpopoff.com. With that said, it is time to close this. Wow, that ran about an hour and a half. This is, I believe, the longest Shockwave Skull Sessions we've had. I want to remind you once again, if you happen to get this episode on a link, you could go back and listen to this episode and all our previous episodes at the roadrunnerrecords.com/Skull Sessions website. That is our home base. You could also check it out on iTunes. And you can also check out the Shockwave Skull Sessions on the Classic Metal Show. Check out cmsradio.net or theclassicmetalshow.com for the scheduled show times. Once again, thanks again to all our guests, and thanks again to you, the listener, for all your support. This is Bob Nalbandian signing off. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Subscribe and listen to all episodes by going to our pages on iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, Spotify, and more. You can listen to all other episodes and access up-to-date information and news on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast by going to our website at www.shockwaveskullsessions.com. Email all comments, questions, and suggestions to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com.